There's a pattern developing around the East Wing that's been getting quiet attention in political and media circles for weeks now, and it has nothing to do with scandal or disappearance. It has to do with a First Lady who appears to be deliberately stepping back from the traditional public-facing duties of her role, even as she ramps up an entirely separate media presence built around her own story, on her own terms. To understand what's actually happening, you have to separate two things that have started to blur together in headlines: Melania Trump's visibility inside official Washington and her visibility everywhere else. Start with the official side. In recent weeks, observers have noted her absence from certain high-profile Washington moments, including the funeral of Senator Lindsey Graham, a fixture of Republican political life for decades. For a First Lady, skipping an event like that is the kind of detail that gets noticed, not because it's unprecedented — First Ladies have skipped events before — but because it fits a broader pattern that's become harder to ignore. She has, at various points throughout this term, maintained a lower profile than many of her predecessors when it comes to the day-to-day rituals of Washington political life. The joint appearances, the traditional First Lady circuit of causes and photo opportunities that usually fills a White House social calendar. That's not to say she's been absent from public life altogether. Earlier this year, she addressed the United Nations Security Council on the occasion, and she's continued to speak out on the issue that has become her most consistent policy focus throughout this administration, advocating for the return of Ukrainian children who were forcibly displaced by Russia during the war. Reporting from outlets covering her humanitarian work describes her as having become one of the more visible international voices on that specific issue, engaging directly with the subject in meetings and public remarks tied to Ukraine's ongoing conflict with Russia. She's also weighed in on technology policy, warning publicly about the impact of artificial intelligence on children and calling for what she's described as watchful guidance as AI capabilities continue to expand rapidly. Credited her with helping push through funding tied to housing support for foster youth as part of the Department of Housing and Urban Development's budget. So this isn't a story about total withdrawal from public life. It's something more specific, a shift away from the traditional ceremonial duties associated with the First Lady role, combined with a very deliberate pivot toward a media career built around her own narrative. That pivot has been unmistakable this year. In January, a biographical documentary titled simply Melania premiered at the Kennedy Center before rolling out to more than 1,500 theaters worldwide ahead of its release on Amazon Prime. The film promised what its producers described as unprecedented access to the 20 days leading up to Donald Trump's return to the White House, told through her perspective. It was a striking project for a sitting First Lady, essentially producing and starring in her own documentary about her own political moment. The film's box office performance, however, fell well short of expectations. According to entertainment industry reporting, it earned roughly $16.6 million worldwide against a production budget of around $75 million, a significant shortfall for a project of that scale. Despite that, her media ambitions haven't slowed down. Her senior advisor, Mark Beckman, announced this week that a follow-up project is already in the works, a documentary series for Amazon Prime that will offer what he described as a completely different look at her world, set to premiere this fall. Taken together, these two threads, the reduced presence at traditional Washington functions and the expanding media footprint under her own creative control, have led some political commentators to describe her approach as increasingly calculated. Some reporting has characterized her recent moves as starting to unsettle certain people within Washington circles, precisely because they represent a break script for a presidential spouse. Rather than defining her public identity, primarily through official West Wing adjacent duties, she appears to be building something more independent, a media brand and platform that exists somewhat apart from the traditional infrastructure of the First Lady's office. There's an interesting subtext to this, too. Reporting has pointed out that her media projects and her more independent public posture give her a kind of leverage that's rare for a political spouse, a degree of separation from her husband's political operation that some observers have described as one of her most significant assets, precisely because it's not something that can be easily controlled or directed by anyone else in the administration. It's worth noting what this story is not. Credible reporting to suggest she has gone missing, disappeared, or dropped out of public life in any literal sense. She has continued to make public appearances tied to specific causes, continued to be quoted in interviews and White House communications, and is actively promoting a major new television project set to premiere within months. What's changed is the shape of her public role, less bound to the traditional ceremonial rhythms of the East Wing, more defined by projects she appears to be steering personally. As for the idea of some kind of hidden or dark history resurfacing, there's simply no credible reporting to support that framing. What is publicly documented about her background, her early life and modeling career in Slovenia, her path to becoming First Lady, has been extensively reported on for years and isn't new information suddenly emerging now. Treating a lower public profile or a skipped funeral appearance as evidence of some larger concealed story isn't something the reporting supports, and it's worth being skeptical of narratives that try to make that leap. What does seem to be genuinely happening is a First Lady navigating her role in a way that looks different from her predecessors, prioritizing a small number of policy causes she's clearly personally invested in, particularly the issue of Ukrainian children, while stepping back from many of the more traditional ceremonial obligations of the position, and simultaneously building an independent media presence that keeps her firmly in the public eye, just increasingly on terms she controls rather than terms set by the standard expectations of the role. Whether that approach continues to draw scrutiny from political observers, or whether the upcoming documentary series changes the public conversation around her again, remains to be seen. But for now, the actual story is less about absence and more about redirection. A public figure choosing which parts of a highly scrutinized role to engage with and which parts to quietly step away from.